December 16, 1944. 5:30 in the morning. 1,600 German artillery pieces opened fire simultaneously along an 80-mile front in the Ardennes forest of Belgium and Luxembourg. The ground shook so hard that men in foxholes thought the earth itself was splitting apart. Trees splintered and fell. Snow cascaded from branches as shell after shell tore into American positions that had been quiet for weeks. Sleeping soldiers were jolted awake by the thunderous roar, many still in their sleeping bags, reaching for weapons they could barely find in the dark. Telephone lines were cut in seconds. Observation posts vanished under rolling walls of fire and smoke. Runners sent into the barrage did not come back. For the men crouching in their holes along the thin American line, the world had become nothing but noise, concussion, and flying steel. Nobody along those 80 miles of front knew what was happening. Nobody knew the scale of what had been unleashed against them. Nobody knew that this was the opening act of the largest battle the United States Army would fight in the entire Second World War. Behind the barrage, more than 400,000 German soldiers surged forward through the freezing pre-dawn darkness. 1,400 tanks and assault guns crawled along narrow forest roads, their engines growling, their tracks crunching through frozen mud and ice. This was Operation Watch on the Rhine, Adolf Hitler's last desperate gamble in the West. The objective was staggering in its ambition. The German armoured spearheads were to smash through the thinly held American line, race 125 miles to the port of Antwerp on the Belgian coast, and split the Allied armies in two. If the port fell, the British and Canadian armies to the north would be cut off from their American allies to the south. Hitler believed this single stroke would force the Western Allies to negotiate a separate peace, freeing Germany to turn its full remaining strength against the Soviet Union advancing from the east. His senior commanders thought the plan was fantasy, but Adolf Hitler would brook no argument. He had made his decision, and 3 entire armies had been set in motion to carry it out. The plan committed those 3 armies along the front. The 6th Panzer Army under SS General Sepp Dietrich held the northern sector. The 5th Panzer Army under General Hasso von Manteuffel held the centre, and the 7th Army under General Erich Brandenberger guarded the southern flank. Dietrich's army contained the most powerful armoured formations Germany still possessed. The 1st SS Panzer Division, Leibstandart, the 12th SS Panzer Division Hitlerjugend, the 2nd SS Panzer Division Das Reich, and the 9th SS Panzer Division Hohenstaufen. These were elite formations, rebuilt and refitted in secret for this single operation. Manteuffel's Wehrmacht force included the 2nd Panzer Division, the Panzer Lehr Division, and the 116th Panzer Division, nicknamed Windhund, the Greyhound. Between them, these units represented the last concentrated armoured reserve that Germany could muster. If this attack failed, there would be nothing left to replace what was lost. The timetable was rigid and astonishingly optimistic. Field Marshal Walther Model, the commander of Army Group B, declared that the armoured columns had to reach the Meuse River by the 4th day. Antwerp had to fall by the 7th day. That meant covering roughly 125 miles from the start line in a single week through some of the most difficult terrain in Western Europe in the dead of winter. The plan demanded a sustained rate of advance comparable to the 1940 Ardennes breakthrough, when German armour had raced through the same forest in a matter of days against a collapsing French defence. But there was a critical difference between 1940 and 1944. In 1940, German fuel supplies were ample. Now they were not. The 6th Panzer Army carried only enough gasoline for roughly 90 to 100 miles of movement per vehicle. The King Tiger tank, the heaviest armoured vehicle in the German arsenal at nearly 70 tons, consumed approximately 2 American gallons of fuel per mile. At that rate, the Army's entire fuel allocation would be exhausted well short of Antwerp. The difference was supposed to come from captured American fuel dumps. Hitler told his commanders this directly during pre-offensive briefings. He was not merely hoping to capture enemy fuel, he was counting on it. The plan required stealing the enemy's gasoline to finish the job. The man chosen to lead the most critical spearhead was 29-year-old Lieutenant Colonel Joachim Peiper of the 1st SS Panzer Division. Peiper was an Eastern Front veteran, a former adjutant to Heinrich Himmler, and a holder of the Knight's Cross with oak leaves. His battle group, known as Kampfgruppe Peiper, numbered approximately 4,800 men and roughly 800 vehicles, including approximately 117 tanks. Among them were the 45 King Tigers of the heavy SS Panzer Battalion 501, though mechanical failures would reduce that number steadily from the first day of movement. Each one was a 70-ton monster with an 88mm gun, capable of destroying any Allied tank at ranges exceeding 2,000 meters. His armored column stretched almost 25 kilometers along the narrow Ardennes roads when fully extended. This single formation was the cutting edge of the entire offensive. Hitler's plan lived or died with Peiper's speed. Dietrich's corps planners had selected 5 westward routes through the Ardennes, labeled Rollbahn A through E, each assigned to a specific armored formation. The 3 northern routes went to the 12th SS Panzer Division. The 2 southern routes, D and E, went to Peiper's 1st SS Panzer Division. Rollbahn D, Peiper's personal route, ran from Lochheim through Honsfeld, Bullingen, Ligneville, Stavelot, Trois Ponts, and Verbermont toward Huy on the Meuse, but speed required roads, and in the Ardennes roads were the problem. The Ardennes is a 4,000 square mile plateau of dense pine and beech forest cut by deep, winding river valleys. The Aue, the Clerf, the Sarme, the Amblève, the Aue, the Lienne, the Meuse. These rivers carve steep gorges through the plateau, and the few paved roads cross them on narrow stone bridges that thread through tight medieval villages and hairpin switchbacks. Single-track stretches meant that a column could only move in one direction at a time. A 70-ton King Tiger could not deploy off the road into the soft, forested ground beside it. It could not turn around once committed to a lane. If the lead vehicle was knocked out, or if the road was blocked by a fallen tree or a demolished bridge, every vehicle behind it stopped. And there was no way around. A single obstacle at the right choke point could halt an entire division's advance for hours. Peiper himself inspected his assigned route on a captured Allied map before the offensive and told his staff bluntly that these were not roads for tanks, they were roads for bicycles. The German field commanders understood this fatal contradiction perfectly. Dietrich later recalled with bitter humor that all Hitler wanted him to do was cross a river, capture Brussels, and then go on and take Antwerp. And all this in the worst time of year, through the Ardennes, when the snow was waist-deep and there was not room to deploy 4 tanks abreast, let alone armoured divisions. When it did not get light until 8 in the morning and was dark again by 4 in the afternoon, with reformed divisions made up chiefly of kids and sick old men. And at Christmas, Field Marshal Model told General Jodl bluntly that this plan had not got a leg to stand on. Manteuffel argued that the infantry available was incapable of carrying out the attack with the necessary violence. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, the nominal theatre commander, dismissed the entire scheme as impossible. None of these objections changed the orders. Hitler would not be moved. The offensive would proceed exactly as he had ordered it. The Americans holding the Ardennes on December 16 had no idea what was coming. Lieutenant General Courtney Hodges's First Army held the sector with 2 corps spread across 85 miles of front. Major General Leonard Guerreau's 5th Corps held the northern end, including the Green 99th Infantry Division. In the south, Major General Troy Middleton's 8th Corps covered the wider stretch with the just-arrived 106th Infantry Division, which had never seen combat. Along with 2 exhausted veteran divisions rebuilding after the devastating Hurtgen Forest fighting, the 4th Infantry Division and the 28th Infantry Division were shadows of their former strength, filled with replacements who had barely learned their squad leaders' names. General Omar Bradley later called this deployment a calculated risk. He was gambling that the Germans would not attack through the Ardennes. He lost that gamble. But what Bradley did not know, and what the German planners had fatally underestimated, was that the American units scattered across the Ardennes possessed exactly the skills needed to fight a delaying battle on a road network. Engineer combat battalions carried tons of TNT, M1 chain demolition kits, anti-tank mines, and the training to drop a stone arch bridge in 20 minutes flat. Their field manuals taught roadblock construction at any defile, fell trees across the road and wire them with mines, string daisy chains of anti-tank mines that could be dragged across a road on signal, prepare bridge demolitions with 2 independent firing circuits so that if one failed, the other would still blow the span. Tank destroyer crews were trained to sight their guns at choke points, engage enemy armor at maximum range, and displace immediately after firing before the enemy could bring counterfire to bear. Cavalry reconnaissance squadrons were trained to screen, delay, and report. Military police controlled traffic at every crossroads and knew the road network better than anyone. None of these units were designed to stop a panzer army head-on, but together, fighting from crossroads to crossroads and bridge to bridge, they would do something far more devastating to the German timetable. They would steal the one thing the offensive could not afford to lose: time. The first Americans to impose that cost were 18 men of the Intelligence and Reconnaissance Platoon, 394th Infantry Regiment, 99th Infantry Division. They were dug in on a wooded ridge, overlooking the village of Lanzerath in Belgium, directly astride Peiper's planned route of advance along Roadblocks. Their leader was 20-year-old First Lieutenant Lyle Buck, Jr. They were not a combat infantry platoon. They were a reconnaissance unit, lightly armed with M1 rifles, Browning automatic rifles, two 30-caliber machine guns, and a Jeep-mounted 50-caliber machine gun. 4 forward artillery observers from Battery C of the 371st Field Artillery had joined them on the ridge. Together they numbered 22 men. When the German barrage opened at 5:30 on December 16, the platoon held its position. By 8 in the morning, the supporting tank destroyer platoon from the 820th Tank Destroyer Battalion had pulled back without coordinating with Buck, leaving the 22 men on the ridge as the only Americans in the entire sector. When approximately 500 paratroopers of the German 9th Parachute Regiment attacked up the open, snow-covered slope in broad daylight, Buck's men opened fire. They broke up 3 consecutive frontal assaults across the day. Technical Sergeant William Slape fired the 50-caliber machine gun until it seized from overheating. Private First Class William Tsakanikas, badly wounded in the face, kept his Browning automatic rifle working with one functioning eye. The platoon was finally overrun in the late afternoon when their ammunition was completely exhausted and every man was either wounded or out of rounds. Those 18 men and 4 artillery observers delayed the lead infantry of the 1st SS Panzer Division's advance for approximately 18 to 20 hours. That was nearly an entire day lost from a timetable that had no days to spare. Peiper himself reportedly stormed into the Café Palm in Lanzerath that evening, demanding to know what was holding up his advance. He was told, incorrectly, that an entire American regiment had pinned the German paratroopers on the ridge. In 1981, after a congressional review, every member of the platoon received decorations: 4 Distinguished Service Crosses, 5 Silver Stars, and 9 Bronze Stars. It was the only platoon-sized unit so honored in American military history. Peiper finally crossed his own front line late on the evening of December 16. He was already behind schedule before he had encountered a single American roadblock. The traffic jam behind the German breakthrough zone was catastrophic. Volksgrenadier infantry divisions, horse-drawn artillery columns, and Otto Skorzeni's Panzer Brigade 150 all clogged the same narrow roads that Peiper's tanks needed. He did not reach Honsfeld until the early morning hours of December 17, where he overran a 99th Division rest center, capturing prisoners and equipment. He pushed on to Bullingen, overran an airfield, and found a prize: an American gasoline dump containing approximately 50,000 gallons of fuel. He forced captured American prisoners to refuel his vehicles at gunpoint and continued west. But the route that had taken German armor 9 hours to traverse in 1940 was already consuming its second full day in 1944. Near the hamlet of Bourgnes, south of Malmedy, at approximately 1 in the afternoon on December 17, Peiper's spearhead encountered a convoy from Battery B, 285th Field Artillery Observation Battalion. The Americans were captured after a brief fight. Then, 84 American prisoners of war were shot in a snow-covered field by elements of Peiper's command. Survivors began staggering into the nearby town of Malmedy, where at approximately 2:30 in the afternoon, 3 of them were found by a patrol of the 291st Engineer Combat Battalion. Lieutenant Colonel David Pergrin reported the killings up the chain of command that afternoon. The news spread along the entire front faster than any telephone signal could carry it. It hardened the resolve of every American unit it reached. From that moment forward, the men at the roadblocks understood that surrender carried no guarantee of survival. They would fight. As night fell on December 17, Peiper's lead tanks ground down the long, switchbacked road toward the stone bridge over the Amblev River at Stavelot. The only American troops in the town were a squad from the 291st Engineer Combat Battalion. These engineers had been sent forward from Malmedy and laid a hasty anti-tank minefield on the cobblestone approach to the bridge. When 3 Panther tanks attempted to rush the bridge in the early evening, the lead Panther hit a mine. The explosion disabled the tank and blocked the road. The column halted. And Peiper, inexplicably, paused for the entire night. In post-war interrogations, he claimed he believed Stavelot was heavily defended. A squad of engineers with a handful of mines had created that illusion. That single pause cost Peiper an entire night of movement that he would never recover. By dawn on December 18, American reinforcements had arrived at Stavelot. A task force built around Company A of the 526th Armoured Infantry Battalion, organized by Major Paul Solis, along with towed anti-tank guns of the 825th Tank Destroyer Battalion, now held the approaches. But critically, the engineers had failed to wire the medieval stone bridge itself for demolition, possibly through misunderstood orders in the chaos. When Peiper's artillery opened fire at 8 in the morning, his lead Panther rammed an anti-tank gun off the road and forced the crossing. The bridge was lost intact. Peiper drove through the burning town and raced west toward his next objective. His destination was Trois Ponts. The name means 3 bridges in French. The town sits exactly where the Saint River flows into the Amblève. Whoever controlled its 3 highway bridges controlled the principal direct route to the Meuse. Lieutenant Colonel Wallace Anderson, commander of the 1111 Engineer Combat Group, had concluded by December 17 that this was where Peiper had to be stopped. He told his officers plainly, "We must stop the enemy, and we must stop him here." Anderson directed Company C of the 51st Engineer Combat Battalion, about 140 engineers under Captain Sam Schäuber, to Trois Ponts on the night of December 17. Major Robert Yates, the battalion's executive officer, took command of the defence on the ground. They set up a daisy chain of anti-tank mines on the eastern approach road and wired all 3 bridges for demolition. When Peiper's leading Panther tanks came down the highway from Stavelot late on the morning of December 18, the engineers fought them with a single-towed 57mm anti-tank gun. The gun crew got off 4 rounds and disabled the lead Panther before their gun was destroyed by return fire. As the German tanks rolled onto the open ground at the eastern edge of town, the engineers blew the bridges. The Amblève Highway Bridge went up first in a roar of smoke and shattered stone. Minutes later, Lieutenant Albert Walters's platoon of the 291st Engineer Combat Battalion blew the Saint River Bridge south of town. A third smaller bridge followed shortly after. In the space of minutes, 3 explosions had sealed off Peiper's direct route to the Meuse River. Peiper later told American interrogators that the demolition of the Trois Ponts bridges was the single most decisive moment of his entire advance. It forced him off his planned route and into the narrow valley road running north of the Amblève. A single road, hemmed in by the river on one side and steep, forested hills on the other, with no room to maneuver and no way around. His 25-kilometre column was now funneled into a geographic trap that would only grow tighter with every mile. That afternoon, as the weather briefly cleared for the first time since the offensive began, 11 P-47 Thunderbolts of the 9th Tactical Air Command found Peiper's column strung out on the narrow road near the village of Cheneux. The fighter bombers destroyed 2 or 3 tanks and roughly 7 half-tracks, and the burning wreckage blocked the already constricted road. Peiper lost approximately 2 hours sitting stationary under repeated air attacks, unable to move forward or back. Pushed north of the Amblève and desperately seeking any route to the Meuse, Peiper's lead Panthers approached a wooden trestle bridge over the Lienne Creek near the village of Habiemont. It was approximately 4:45 in the afternoon on December 18. A 14-man squad of Company A 291st Engineer Combat Battalion, led by Lieutenant Alvin Edelstein, had reached the bridge first and wired it for demolition. As the Panthers rolled to within roughly 100 meters of the crossing, close enough for the tankers to see the wooden span ahead, Edelstein's men fired the charges. The bridge collapsed into the creek bed with a crash that echoed off the valley walls. With it went Peiper's last realistic route to the Meuse River. The phrase he is reported to have shouted, slamming his fist on the turret of his tank, entered the vocabulary of the entire battle. Those damned engineers. In the original German, Diese verdammten Pioniere. The outburst was recorded in Peiper's own post-war interrogations and confirmed by officers riding in the column behind him. Janice Holt Giles, later used it as the title of her 1970 history of the 291st. While Peiper was crossing the Stavelot Bridge that morning of December 18, just 3 to 5 miles to the north along the road to Francorchamps, sat one of the largest American fuel stockpiles in all of Europe. First Army Fuel Depot No. 3 contained approximately 1,115,000 gallons of 80-octane gasoline stored in jerrycans. Together with the neighboring depot, the total exceeded 3 million gallons. This was the fuel Peiper had been ordered to capture. He did not know it was there, and he drove west instead. American quartermasters organized a frantic evacuation, pulling most of the fuel back to Liège by truck. When a German armored probe from Peiper's rearguard appeared to be heading north toward the dump, Major Solis's men poured gasoline from jerrycans into a deep road cut north of Stavelot, a cut with no turnout and steep sides, and set it ablaze. The official figure is that 124,000 gallons were burned to deny them to the enemy. The German vehicles turned back from the wall of flame. Across the entire Ardennes offensive, the Germans failed to capture any significant American fuel reserves. The gamble that the entire plan depended on had failed. Forced onto the narrow Amblève Valley Road with no bridges ahead and no fuel behind, Peiper captured the village of Stoumont on the morning of December 19, after a 2-hour tank battle. Then he was checked by 16 American tanks and tank destroyers from the 740th Tank Battalion and elements of the 119th Infantry Regiment, 30th Infantry Division, just west of the Stoumont railway station. This was his farthest advance to the west. He would go no further. Behind him, the 30th Infantry Division retook Stavelot on December 19, severing his supply line completely. The 82nd Airborne Division blocked him from the south. By December 20, Kampfgruppe Peiper was encircled in the village of Gleize with no fuel, dwindling ammunition, and no prospect of relief. On the night of December 23, Peiper ordered his remaining 800 men to abandon their vehicles and break out on foot through the frozen forest. The wounded and a rear guard of about 127 men remained behind in Gleize. The breakout column slipped south under cover of darkness, crossed the Amblève on a narrow footbridge, and walked 36 hours through frozen woods and deep snow to reach German lines at the village of Wanne. When Peiper reached a medical station, he told the doctor plainly, "We left with 3,000 men from Germany, and now we have 717. You can find the others the whole way along our path." He left behind roughly 135 armoured vehicles, sitting abandoned in and around Gleize. Among them were approximately 6 King Tigers, 13 Panthers, 7 Panzer IVs, and 47 half-tracks. The spearhead of Hitler's last great offensive in the west had been ended not by a great battle but by blown bridges, a handful of mines, and a narrow road that became a trap. The 291st Engineer Combat Battalion had not been designed for this kind of fight. Lieutenant Colonel David Pergrin, its 27-year-old commander, was a Penn State engineering graduate and a Reserve Officer Training Corps officer. His battalion of 620 men had been doing road maintenance, lumber milling, and bridge construction along First Army's main supply route when the offensive struck. Within 48 hours, almost by accident of geography and initiative, his engineers had personally stopped the most dangerous armoured formation in the German army. The 291st went on to build 19 bridges under fire during the rest of the campaign, and later constructed a 1,100-foot bridge at Remagen in 32 hours, under continuous enemy fire. It became the most decorated combat engineer battalion of the entire war. Pergrin, who later wrote 2 books about the battle, survived the war by 67 years and died in 2012 at the age of 95. His men's actions at Stavelot, Trois Ponts, and the Lienne Creek Bridge had not appeared in any plan. No general had ordered them to stop Kampfgruppe Peiper. They did it because they were there, because they had the demolitions and the training, and because they understood that every bridge they dropped bought hours that their army desperately needed. But Pergrin's battalion was far from the only engineer unit that shaped the outcome of the battle. The 51st Engineer Combat Battalion blew the Amblève Bridge at Trois Ponts. The 291st blew the Salm Bridge south of town. At Wiltz on December 18, the 44th Engineer Combat Battalion held the high ground north of town and demolished the bridge as they withdrew, allowing the 28th Division's command group to escape encirclement. At Bastogne, the engineers of the 326th Airborne Engineer Battalion filled gaps in the perimeter as front-line infantry, fighting with rifles alongside the paratroopers. At Hosingen, Company B of the 103rd Engineer Combat Battalion and Company K of the 110th Infantry held for 2 full days against an entire Volksgrenadier division. From Butgenbach to Bastogne, Engineer Combat Battalions defended crossroads, demolished bridges, and planted minefields. Their collective effect was to convert the entire Ardennes road network into a sequential demolition zone that consumed the offensive's momentum, one crossing at a time. While Peiper was being funneled into his trap in the north, the German 5th Panzer Army was running into an identical problem in the centre of the front. The town of Saint Vith was a small Belgian rail junction whose 6 paved roads were the only adequate routes for Manteufel's armour to break west through the Schnee-Eifel range. It was a Day 2 objective on the German timetable. It did not fall until Day 5. When the offensive opened, the Green 106th Infantry Division was holding the Schnee-Eifel sector east of town. 2 of its 3 regiments, the 422nd and the 423rd Infantry, were quickly encircled in the forested hills. On December 19, approximately 8,000 men laid down their arms. It was the largest American surrender in the European theatre. But the 3rd Regiment, the 424th Infantry, fell back towards Saint Vith and joined the defence. Into this collapsing pocket came the 7th Armoured Division, driving 60 miles south from the Netherlands. Brigadier General Bruce Clark, the Combat Command B commander, arrived ahead of his troops on the morning of December 17 and was placed in personal command of the defence of Saint Vith. He spent the afternoon, by his own account, as a traffic cop, standing in the road and physically forcing his tankers eastward through the panicked westward stream of retreating soldiers. Clark organised a mobile defence he called a horseshoe, gathering fragments of 5 different units into a coherent fighting perimeter. The 7th Armoured Division's combat commands. The surviving regiment of the 106th, the 112th Infantry of the 28th Division, Combat Command B of the 9th Armoured Division under Brigadier General William Hoge, and the remnants of the 14th Cavalry Group. From December 17 to 21, this composite force held the town against the 18th and 62nd Volksgrenadier Divisions and heavy armoured elements, including King Tiger tanks. Saint Vith finally fell on the evening of December 21 when the King Tigers broke through the perimeter. Clark's force withdrew across the Salm River on the night of December 22 when a sudden freeze hardened the waterlogged ground enough for vehicles to move off the roads. The 5-day hold had absorbed Manteufel's entire northern thrust and created traffic jams behind the German lines that Field Marshal Model himself could not untangle. Farther south, the small town of Bastogne sat at the convergence of 7 hard-topped roads and 1 rail line. General Heinrich von Luttwitz, commanding the 47th Panzer Corps, told his division commanders before the offensive that Bastogne must be taken. Otherwise, he said, it would remain an abscess on their lines of communication. But the German plan did not actually call for the panzer divisions to stop and fight for the town. They were supposed to bypass it while the 26th Volksgrenadier Division cleaned up behind them. Standing directly in their path was Major General Norman Coter's 28th Infantry Division, deployed along a 25-mile front along the Our and Clerf rivers. The 110th Infantry Regiment under Colonel Hurley Fuller absorbed the combined impact of the Second Panzer Division, Panzer Lehr, and the 26th Volksgrenadier Division in a series of desperate crossroads, stands at Marnac, Hosingen, Clairvaux, and Consthum. At Clairvaux, Fuller defended his command post in the medieval chateau with headquarters troops until his ammunition ran out. The 110th Infantry was effectively destroyed as a fighting unit, but it bought Manteufel 3 full days that his timetable had never accounted for. Behind the disintegrating 28th Division, Combat Command R of the 9th Armoured Division established sacrificial armoured roadblocks along the eastern approaches to Bastogne. Each task force was deliberately too small to halt a panzer division, just 1 tank company and 1 armoured infantry company apiece. Each was overrun. But in succession, over December 17 to 19, they delayed the German advance hours at a time, buying precious time. Combat Command B of the 10th Armoured Division, ordered north from General George Patton's Third Army by Eisenhower, reached Bastogne late on December 18 under Colonel William Roberts. General Middleton asked Roberts how many teams he could form. Roberts replied 3. He split his command immediately. Team Cherry under Lieutenant Colonel Henry Cherry went east toward Longville with approximately 30 tanks and 400 men. Team O'Hara under Lieutenant Colonel James O'Hara went southeast toward Warden. Team de Sobry under Major William de Sobry went north along the Houffalize Road to Neuville. At Neuville, on the fog-shrouded morning of December 19, Team de Sobry's tanks and tank destroyers engaged the Second Panzer Division at point-blank range. In the confusion of the dense fog, de Sobry's gunners destroyed approximately 17 German tanks, while losing only 1 tank destroyer and 4 lighter vehicles. The 1st Battalion of the 500, 6th Parachute Infantry Regiment, reinforced de Sobry that same day. Its commander, Lieutenant Colonel James Laprade, was killed in action during the fighting. De Sobry himself was wounded and captured, but by the time the position withdrew to Foy on December 20, the 2nd Panzer Division had lost roughly 30 tanks and a full day of movement. On the eastern approach, Panzer Lehr's commander, General Fritz Bayerlein, was told by a Belgian civilian that 40 American tanks had recently passed through the area. Bayerlein decided his force was too small to push on to Bastogne unsupported and dug in at the village of Majoret. That single moment of caution, caused directly by the visible presence of American armor on the roads, cost Panzer Lehr the town of Bastogne. The 101st Airborne Division drove 100 miles through the night of December 18 and arrived at Bastogne by 9 the next morning, just hours before the Germans closed the ring. On December 22, Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe issued his famous one-word reply to the German surrender demand. The siege continued through Christmas, with the perimeter held by the paratroopers, the survivors of Combat Command B of the 10th Armoured, and the 705th Tank Destroyer Battalion's M18 Hellcat tank destroyers under Lieutenant Colonel Clifford Templeton. The 4th Armoured Division, leading Patton's 3rd Army northward, finally broke through near the village of Assenois at 4:45 in the afternoon on December 26. The pattern of small units holding crossroads and buying time repeated across the entire width of the front. On the northern shoulder, the 99th and 2nd Infantry Divisions held the twin villages of Rocherath and Krinkelt in a brutal 3-day fight that pinned 3 German divisions in place. They pulled back to the high ground of Elsenborn Ridge, which held for the duration of the entire battle. The 12th SS Panzer Division Hitlerjugend was forced to abandon its entire assigned route and pull south. For the duration of the campaign, no German armour ever passed Elsenborn. The entire northern route allocation was nullified by 2 American infantry divisions, at Hotten, on the Ardennes River. Headquarters troops and engineers of the 51st Engineer Combat Battalion held the only adequate bridge against the 116th Panzer Division with light weapons and a single bulldozer. The 116th Panzer never crossed there. At Baraque de Fraiture, the highest point in Belgium, Major Arthur Parker, the 3rd of the 589th Field Artillery Battalion, held a critical crossroads with the remnants of his battery and a growing collection of stragglers and reinforcements that eventually numbered several 100 men, supported by 3 howitzers, for 4 days until the 2nd SS Panzer Division Das Reich overran the position on December 23. The westernmost point any German armour reached was the village of Foy-Notre-Dame, just 5 miles from the Meuse Bridge at Dinant. The 2nd Panzer Division's spearhead arrived there on the night of December 23 and stopped, out of fuel. On Christmas Day, the 29th Armoured Brigade of the British 30th Corps and Combat Command B of the American 2nd Armoured Division attacked into the immobile German pocket and destroyed the battle group where it sat. The panzers had come within 5 miles of the Meuse. They never moved again. Every hour, a panzer column sat motionless at a blown bridge or stuck behind a traffic jam. Its engines burned irreplaceable fuel. Peiper's 36-hour transit from the Eifel to Stavelot, a distance that German armour had covered in 9 hours during the 1940 campaign, consumed fuel that was supposed to carry his column all the way to the Meuse. Bayerlein stalled at Magère. Laukert bled tanks at Neuville. Waldenburg was turned away at Hotten. The 2nd Panzer ran dry at Selles. Each formation reached the limit of its fuel range, because American roadblocks had forced it to fight at the wrong place and burn fuel it could not replace. The interaction was self-reinforcing. Roadblocks caused delays. Delays burned fuel. Empty fuel tanks meant the Panthers could not maneuver around the next obstacle. And by December 22, when the overcast skies finally cleared for good, the same immobile armor became visible targets for the fighter bombers of the 9th and 19th Tactical Air Commands. The result was devastating. Tanks, half-tracks, trucks, and horse-drawn wagons were destroyed by the hundreds on roads they could not leave, creating still more wreckage that trapped still more vehicles behind them. The fuel dump at Saint Vith, captured by the 116th Panzer Division on December 20, held only about 20,000 gallons, barely enough to move a single battalion. The 50,000 gallons Peiper had captured at Bullingen on December 17 was the only significant American fuel seized during the entire offensive. Hugh Cole, the official United States Army historian, concluded that the only American fuel casualty of the entire campaign was the 124,000 gallons deliberately burned at Stavelot to deny it to the enemy. The German gamble on captured fuel had failed completely. The cumulative effect of all those small stands at crossroads and bridges was the most precious commodity in warfare, time, and Allied commanders converted that time into reinforcements that overwhelmed the offensive. On the evening of December 17, Eisenhower committed the 18th Airborne Corps to the Ardennes. The 82nd Airborne under Brigadier General James Gavin went to Werbermont. The 101st Airborne under McAuliffe went to Bastogne. The 11,840 men of the 101st drove 100 miles through the night and arrived just hours before the Germans closed in. That razor-thin margin of 12 to 36 hours, the difference between a defended Bastogne and an open road, was bought directly by the platoon at Lanzerath, the engineers at Trois Ponts and Habiemont, the 28th Infantry Division on the Clerf, and the armoured roadblocks on the Bastogne approaches. At the Verdun Commanders' Conference on December 19, Eisenhower asked General George Patton how soon he could attack north into the German flank. Patton answered, 48 hours. The room was stunned. He could make the promise because his intelligence chief, Colonel Oskar Koch, had been tracking the German build-up since December 9, and Patton had already ordered his staff to prepare contingency plans for a 90-degree pivot northward. The code phrase to execute was, play ball. Over the following days, the Third Army turned 3 full divisions, the 4th Armoured, the 26th Infantry, and the 80th Infantry, from an eastward-facing offensive in the Saar to a northward attack toward Bastogne, moving approximately 133,000 vehicles through the worst winter weather in 50 years. The 4th Armoured Division, led by Lieutenant Colonel Creighton Abrams and his 37th Tank Battalion, broke through to Bastogne near Assenois at 4:45 in the afternoon on December 26. Reinforcements poured in from the north as well. Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery, given command of the northern half of the Bulge on December 20, moved the 3rd Armoured Division, the 30th Infantry Division, the 84th Infantry Division, and elements of the 2nd Armoured Division south into the threatened sector. The British 30th Corps under Lieutenant General Brian Horrocks was positioned along the Meuse from Givet to Liège as a final backstop. By January, total Allied strength committed to the Ardennes counteroffensive reached approximately 610,000 men. None of these reinforcements would have arrived in time if the German spearheads had reached the Meuse on the 3rd or 4th day as planned. The reinforcements arrived where they needed to be because the spearheads were still 30 to 60 miles short of the Meuse on day 7. The German commanders understood exactly what had happened to them. Peiper told American interrogators that if he had captured the bridges at Trois Ponts intact and had enough fuel, he would have reached the Meuse by the evening of December 18. Manteuffel wrote afterward that the Ardennes terrain could not be overcome by any quantity of armour without secure roads. He personally drove forward to attempt to clear traffic jams on the Ourthe and failed. Model was seen at the Schonberg crossroads east of Saint Vith, personally trying to wave vehicles through a gridlock of his own making. When units were reported stalled, he ordered their officers court-martialed, then withdrew the orders when it became clear the units physically could not move. Dietrich, by December 22, had reportedly turned operational decisions over to his chief of staff, Fritz Kramer. Hitler refused to authorize any withdrawal until January 8, 1945. By then there was nothing left to withdraw. The Battle of the Bulge cost the American army approximately 89,000 casualties, including roughly 19,000 killed. It remains the largest single battle in United States military history. German losses ran between 67,000 and 100,000, and the irreplaceable reserves of armor, fuel, ammunition, and trained crews that had been hoarded for months were gone in weeks. The offensive consumed Germany's last strategic reserve in the West. Within 3 months, Allied armies would cross the Rhine, and within 5 months, the war in Europe would be over. Today, the villages and crossroads of the Ardennes carry the memory of those December days in stone and bronze. At Gleize, a King Tiger tank sits in the village square, recovered from the wreckage Peiper left behind. At Bastogne, the star-shaped Madison Memorial bears the names of every American state. At Lanzerath, a modest marker stands on the ridge where 18 men held against 500. At Trois Ponts, rebuilt bridges span rivers that once stopped an army cold. The German offensive was broken in its first 72 hours, and it was broken in geographic units of yards. From the moment 18 men refused to leave a ridge above Lanzerath, the timetable was dead. From the moment 14 engineers blew a wooden bridge over the Lienne Creek, the spearhead had nowhere left to go. From the moment 3 understrength task forces set up roadblocks outside Bastogne, 2 panzer divisions lost the speed they had been designed to deliver. The panzers never reached the Meuse. They never captured the fuel that the entire plan depended on. By Christmas, German tanks sat motionless on frozen forest roads, their crews walking eastward through the snow toward a homeland that had less than 5 months of war left in it. Hitler's last offensive was over. It had been broken not by a single decisive engagement, but by the accumulated weight of hundreds of small, anonymous stands at bridges, crossroads, and ridgelines across the Ardennes forest. Engineers who wired demolition charges and waited until they could see the markings on the approaching tanks before pressing the detonator. Cavalrymen who held a junction for 3 hours and then fell back to the next one and did it again. Tank destroyer crews who knocked out the lead vehicle in a column, then displaced through the trees before the return fire arrived. Riflemen in frozen foxholes who simply would not leave. Manteufel's verdict, given in post-war interrogation, was that the offensive failed because it could not be sustained at the necessary speed. Peiper's verdict was shorter, and it became the title of a book by Janice Holt Giles, Those Damned Engineers.